Continuing the Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James. We are continuing lectures 11, 12, and 13. Saintliness. These early Quakers were Puritans indeed. The slightest inconsistency between profession and deed jarred some of them to active protest. John Woolman writes in his diary, "In these journeys I have been where much cloth hath been dyed, and have at sundry times walked over ground where much of their dye-stuffs has drained away. This hath produced a longing in my mind that people might come into cleanliness of spirit, cleanliness of person, and cleanliness about their houses and garments, dyes being invented partly to please the eye and partly to hide dirt." Well, sometimes it just hides the fact that something is old. Or I have felt in this weak state, when traveling in dirtiness and affected with unwholesome scents, a strong desire that the nature of dyeing cloth to hide dirt may be more fully considered. Washing our garments to keep them sweet is cleanly, but it is the opposite to real cleanliness to hide dirt in them. Through giving way to hiding dirt in our garments, a spirit which would conceal that which is disagreeable is strengthened. Real cleanliness becometh a holy people, but hiding that which is not clean by coloring our garments seems contrary to the sweetness of sincerity. Through some sorts of dyes, cloth is rendered less useful, and if the value of dye-stuffs and expense of dyeing and the damage done to cloth were all added together, and that cost applied to keeping all sweet and clean, how much more would real cleanliness prevail? Thinking often on these things, the use of hats and garments dyed with a dye heartful to them, and wearing more clothes in summer than are useful, of course he's not talking modesty, grew more uneasy to me, believing them to be customs which have not their foundation in pure wisdom. Now, I mean modesty in terms of how much you cover or uncover. And nowadays, over the past, century, they've been trying to get people to wear less and charge at least as much for it. Because you need some sort of ideology or mythology or something to get people to not cover properly, you could say. The apprehension of being singular from my beloved friends was a strait upon me, and thus I continued in the use of some things contrary to my judgment about 9 months. Then I thought of getting a hat, the natural color of the fur, but the apprehension of being looked upon as one affecting singularity felt uneasy to me. On this account, I was under close exercise of mind in the time of our general spring meeting in 1762, greatly desiring to be rightly directed, when, being deeply bowed in spirit before the Lord, I was made willing to submit to what I apprehended was required of me, and when I returned home, got a hat of the natural color of the fur. In attending meetings, this singularity was a trial to me, and more especially at this time, as white hats were used by some who were fond of following the changeable modes of dress, as some friends who knew not from what motives I wore it grew shy of me. I felt my way for a time shut up in the exercise of the ministry. Some friends were apprehensive that my wearing such a hat savored of an affected singularity. Those who spoke with me in a friendly way, I generally informed in a few words that I believed my wearing it was not in my own will. When the craving for moral consistency and purity is developed to this degree, the subject may well find the outer world too full of shocks to dwell in, and can unify his life and keep his soul unspotted only by withdrawing from it. That law which impels the artist to achieve harmony in his composition by simply dropping out whatever jars or suggests a discord, rules also in the spiritual life. To omit, says Stevenson, is the one art in literature. If I knew how to omit, I should ask no other knowledge, and life, when full of disorder and slackness and vague superfluity, can no more have what we call character than literature can have it under similar conditions. So monasteries and communities of sympathetic devotees open their doors, and in their changeless order, characterized by omissions quite as much as constitutive actions, the holy-minded person finds that inner smoothness and cleanness which it is torture to him to feel violated at every turn by the discordancy and brutality of secular existence. That the scrupulosity of purity may be carried to a fantastic extreme must be admitted. In this it resembles asceticism, to which further symptoms of saintliness we had better turn next. The adjective ascetic is applied to conduct originating on diverse psychological levels, which I might as well begin by distinguishing from one another. Asceticism may be a mere expression of organic hardihood, disgusted with too much ease. Temperance in meat and drink, simplicity of apparel, chastity, and non-pampering of the body generally, may be fruits of the love of purity, shocked by whatever savors of the sensual. They may also be fruits of love. That is, they may appeal to the subject in the light of sacrifices which he is happy in making to the deity whom he acknowledges. Again, ascetic mortifications and torments may be due to pessimistic feelings about the self combined with theological beliefs concerning expiation. The devotee may feel that he is buying himself free or escaping worse sufferings hereafter by doing penance now. In psychopathic persons, mortifications may be entered on irrationally by a sort of obsession or fixed idea which comes as a challenge and must be worked off, because only thus does the subject get his interior consciousness feeling right again. Finally, ascetic exercises may, in rarer instances, be prompted by genuine perversions of the bodily sensibility, in consequence of which normal pain-giving stimuli are actually felt as pleasures. I will try to give an instance under each of these heads in turn, but it is not easy to get them pure, for in cases pronounced enough to be immediately classed as ascetic, several of the assigned motives usually work together. Moreover, before citing any examples at all, I must invite you to some general psychological considerations, which apply to all of them alike. A strange moral transformation has, within the past century, swept over our Western world. We no longer think that we are called on to face physical pain with equanimity. It is not expected of a man that he should either endure it or inflict much of it, and to listen to the recital of cases of it makes our flesh creep, morally as well as physically. The way in which our ancestors looked upon pain as an eternal ingredient of the world's order, and both caused and suffered it as a matter of course portion of their day's work, fills us with amazement. We wonder that any human beings could have been so callous. The result of this historic alteration is that even in the Mother Church herself, where ascetic discipline has such a fixed traditional prestige as a factor of merit, it has largely come into desuetude, if not discredit. A believer who flagellates or macerates himself today arouses more wonder and fear than emulation. Now, I wonder if that how many occultists that factors into. And other New Agers that are, I mean, not all occultists, not all New Agers, I'm not saying that, but, go and cry and put themselves through difficulty and make it known that they're being put through difficulty for, similar reasons, right? Many Catholic writers who admit that the times have changed in this respect do so resigningly, and even add that perhaps it is as well not to waste feelings in regretting the matter, for to return to the heroic corporeal discipline of ancient days might be an extravagance. Now, might be something else instead, like if a person's trying to atone through self-harm, then, well, what if they just experience the self-harm here and even more in the hereafter? It's not the same thing as approaching saying, I need this, I deserve the corporeal punishment for my crime, and they get the corporeal punishment for their crime, whether they're being executed or whatever. That's, there's some honor to that, but beating your, whipping yourself in your bedroom because you saw a bad movie or something is not something people should be doing, or whatever people favor. Where to seek the easy and pleasant seems indistinctive, and indistinctive it appears to be in man. Any deliberate tendency to pursue the hard and painful as such, and for their own sakes, might well strike one as purely abnormal. Nevertheless, in moderate degrees, it is natural and even usual to human nature to court the arduous. It is only the extreme manifestations of the tendency that can be regarded as a paradox. The psychological reasons for this lie near the surface. When we drop abstractions and take what we call our will in the act, we see that it is a very complex function. It involves both stimulations and inhibitions. It follows generalized habits. It is escorted by reflective criticisms, and it leaves good or bad taste of itself behind. According to the manner of the performance, the result is that, quite apart from the immediate pleasure which any sensible experience might give us, our own general moral attitude in procuring or undergoing the experience brings with it a secondary satisfaction or distaste. Some men and women, indeed there are, who can live on smiles and the word yes forever, but for others, indeed for most, this is too tepid and relaxed a moral climate. Passive happiness is slack and insipid, and soon grows mawkish and intolerable. Some austerity and wintry negativity, some roughness, danger, stringency, and effort, some no must be mixed in, to procure the sense of an existence with character and texture and power. The range of individual differences in this respect is enormous, but whatever the mixture of yeses and nos may be, a person is infallibly aware, when he has struck it in the right proportion for him. This, he feels, is my proper vocation. This is the optimum, the life, the law, for me to live. Here I find the degree of equilibrium, safety, calm, and leisure, which I need are. Here I find the challenge, passion, fight, and hardship, without which my soul's energy expires. Every individual soul, in short, like every individual machine or organism, has its own best conditions. Our efficiency. A given machine will run best under a certain steam pressure, a certain amperage, an organism under a certain diet, weight, or exercise. You seem to do best, I heard a doctor say to a patient, at about 140 millimeters of arterial tension, and it is just so with our sundry souls. Some are happiest in calm weather, some need the sense of tension, strong volition, to make them feel alive and well. For these latter souls, whatever is gained from day to day must be paid for by sacrifice and inhibition, or else it comes too cheap and has no zest. When the characters of this latter sort become religious, they are apt to turn the edge of their need of effort and negativity against their natural self, and the ascetic life gets evolved as a consequence. When Professor Tyndall, in one of his lectures, tells us that Thomas Carlyle put him into his bathtub every morning of a freezing Berlin winter, he proclaimed one of the lowest grades of asceticism. Even without Carlyle, most of us find it necessary to our soul's health to start the day with a rather cool immersion. A little farther along the scale, we get such statements as this, from one of my correspondents, an agnostic. Often at night, in my warm bed, I would feel ashamed to depend so on the warmth, and whatever the thought would come over me, I would have to get up, no matter what time of the night it was, and stand for a minute in the cold, just so as to prove my manhood. Such cases as these belong simply to our head. One, in the next case, we probably have a mixture of heads 2 and 3. The asceticism becomes far more systematic and pronounced. The writer is a Protestant, whose sense of moral energy could doubtless be gratified on no lower terms. And I take his case from Starbuck's manuscript collection, I practiced fasting and mortification of the flesh. I secretly made burlap shirts and put the burrs next to the skin and wore pebbles on my shoes. In my shoes. I would spend nights flat on my back on the floor without any covering. The Roman Church has organized and codified all this sort of thing and given it a market value in the shape of merit, but we see the cultivation of hardship cropping out under every sky and in every faith as a spontaneous need of character. Well, not every faith, but thus we read of Channing when first settled as a Unitarian minister. That he was now more simple than ever, and seemed to have become incapable of any form of self-indulgence. He took the smallest room in the house for his study, though he might easily have commanded one more light, airy, and in every way more suitable, and chose for his sleeping chamber an attic which he shared with his younger brother. The furniture of the latter might have answered for the cell of an anchorite, and consisted of a hard mattress on a cot bedstead, plain wooden chairs, and a table with matting on the floor. It was without fire, and to cold he was throughout life extremely sensitive, but he never complained or appeared in any way to be conscious of inconvenience. I recollect, says his brother, after one most severe night, that in the morning he sportively thus alluded to his suffering: "If my bed were my country, I should be somewhat like Bonaparte. I have no control except over the part in which I occupy. The instant I move, frost takes possession. In sickness, only would he change, for the time, his apartment, and accept a few comforts. The dress, too, that he habitually adopted was a most inferior quality, and garments were constantly worn, which the world would call mean, though an almost feminine neatness preserved him from the least appearance of neglect." And that's from Memoirs of W.E. Channing, Boston, 1840, Volume 1, 196 is the page. Channing's asceticism, such as it was evidently a compound of hardihood and love of purity. The democracy, which is an offshoot of the enthusiasm of humanity. America was never a democracy, by the way. And of which I will speak later under the head of the cult of poverty, doubtless bore also a share. Certainly there was no pessimistic element in his case. In the next case, we have a strongly pessimistic element, so that it belongs under head 4. John Cennick was Methodism's first lay preacher. In 1735, he was convicted of sin while walking in Cheapside. And at once left off sing-songing, card-playing, and attending theaters. Sometimes he wished to go to a popish monastery to spend his life in devout retirement. At other times he longed to live in a cave, sleeping on fallen leaves, feeding on forest fruits. He fasted long and often, and prayed 9 times a day, fancying dry bread too great an indulgence for so great a sinner as himself. He began to feed on potatoes, acorns, crabs, and grass, and often wished that he could live on roots and herbs. At length, in 1737, he found peace with God and went on his way rejoicing. L. Tyerman, The Life and Times of the Reverend John Wesley, Volume 1, 274 page. In this poor man we have morbid melancholy and fear, and the sacrifices made are to purge out sin and to buy safety. The hopelessness of Christian theology in respect of the flesh and the natural man generally has, in systematizing fear, made of it one tremendous incentive to self-mortification. It would be quite unfair, however, in spite of the fact that this incentive has often been worked in a mercenary way for hortatory purposes, to call it a mercenary incentive. The impulse to expiate and do penance is, in its first intention, far too immediate and spontaneous an expression of self-despair and anxiety to be obnoxious to any such reproach, in the form of loving sacrifice, of spending all we have to show our devotion, ascetic discipline of the severest sort, may be the fruit of the highly optimistic religious feeling. M. Vianney, the cure of Ars, was a French country priest whose holiness was exemplary. We read in his life the following account of his inner need of sacrifice. On this path, M. Vianney said, "It is only the first step that cost. There is in mortification a balm and a savor without which one cannot live. When once one has made their acquaintance, there is but one way in which to give oneself to God, that is, to give oneself entirely and to keep nothing for oneself. The little that one keeps is only good to trouble one and to make one suffer. Accordingly, he imposed it on himself that he should never smell a flower, never drink when parched with thirst, never drive away a fly, never show disgust before a repugnant object, never complain of anything that had to do with his personal comfort, never sit down, never lean upon his elbows when he was kneeling. The cure of Ars was very sensitive to cold, but he would never take means to protect himself against it. During a very severe winter, one of his missionaries contrived a false floor to his confessional and placed a metal case of hot water beneath. The trick succeeded, and the saint was deceived. God is very good, he said, with emotion. This year, through all the cold, my feet have always been warm. In this case, that's A. Monin, the Curie de Ars, V. de MJBM Vianney, 1864, page 545, abridged. In this case, the spontaneous impulse to make sacrifices for the pure love of God was probably the uppermost conscious motive. We may class it then under our head. 3. Some authors think that the impulse to sacrifice is the main religious phenomenon. It is a universal phenomenon certainly, and lies deeper than any special creed. Here, for instance, is what seems to be a spontaneous example of it, simply expressing what seemed right at the time between the individual and his Maker. Cotton Mather, the New England Puritan divine, is generally reputed a rather grotesque pedant, yet what is more touching, simply, than his relation of what happened when his wife came to die. When I saw, too, what a point of resignation I was now called of the Lord, he said, I resolved, with his help, therein to glorify him. So 2 hours before my lovely consort expired, I kneeled by her bedside, and I took her into my 2 hands, a dear hand, the dearest in the world. With her, thus, in my hands, I solemnly and sincerely gave her up unto the Lord, and in token of my real resignation, I gently put her out of my hands, and laid away a most lovely hand, resolving that I would never touch it more. This was the hardest and perhaps the bravest action that ever I did. She told me that she signed and sealed my act of resignation, and though before that she called for me continually, she after this never asked for me any more. B. Wendell, Cotton Mather, New York, page 198. Father Vianney's asceticism. Father Vianney's asceticism, taken in its totality, was simply the result of a permanent flood of high spiritual enthusiasm, longing to make proof of itself. The Roman Church has, in its incomparable fashion, collected all the motives towards asceticism together, and so codified them that anyone wishing to pursue Christian perfection may find a practical system mapped out for him in any one of a number of ready-made manuals. That of the earlier Jesuits, Rodriguez, which has been translated into all languages, is one of the best known. A convenient modern manual, very well put together, is La Ascétique Chrétienne by M. J. Rebet, Paris, Pelsvig, Novella, edition 1898. The dominant church notion of perfection is, of course, the negative one of avoidance of sin. Sin proceeds from concupiscence, and concupiscence from our carnal passions and temptations, chief of which are pride, sensuality in all its forms. Well, whatever we have can be directed towards good or evil choices, right? And the loves of worldly excitement and possession. All these sources of sin must be resisted, and discipline and austerities are a most efficacious mode of meeting them. Hence, there are always in these books chapters on self-mortification, but whenever a procedure is codified, the more delicate spirit of it evaporates, and if we wish the undiluted ascetic spirit, the passion of self-contempt, wreaking itself on the poor flesh, the divine irrationality of devotion, making a sacrificial gift of all it has, its sensibilities, namely, to the object of its adoration, we must go to autobiographies or other individual documents. St. John of the Cross, a Spanish mystic who flourished, or rather who existed, for there was little that suggested flourishing about him, in the 16th century, will supply a passage suitable for our purpose. First of all, carefully excite in yourself an habitual affectionate will in all things to imitate Jesus Christ. Because all that stuff about, don't just claim, just don't call him Lord. Don't just claim him. You got to take up that cross and follow him, right? That was the point, not rely on the cross. Of course, that was Jesus speaking, but the people after them said rely on the cross. But if anything agreeable offers itself to your senses, yet does not at the same time tend purely to the honor and glory of God, renounce it and separate yourselves from it for the love of Christ, who, all his life long, had no other taste or wish than to do the will of his Father, whom he called his meat and nourishment. For example, you take satisfaction in hearing of things in which the glory of God bears no part. Deny yourself this satisfaction, mortify your wish to listen. You take pleasure in seeing objects which do not raise your mind to God. Refuse yourself this pleasure, and turn away your eyes. The same with conversations and all other things. Act similarly so far as you are able with the operations of the senses, striving to make yourself free from their yokes. The radical remedy lies in the mortification of the four great natural passions: joy, hope, fear, and grief. You must seek to deprive these of every satisfaction and leave them, as it were, in darkness and the void. Well, can't you just see them as means rather than the thing? Let your soul, therefore, turn always, not to what is most easy, but to what is hardest, not to what tastes best, but to what is most distasteful, not to what most pleases, but to what disgusts, not to matter of consolation, but to matter for desolation rather, not to rest, but to labor, not to desire the more, but the less, not to aspire what is highest and most precious, but what is lowest and most contemptible, not to will anything, but to will nothing, not to seek the best in everything, but to seek the worst, so that you may enter, for the love of Christ, into a complete destitution, a perfect poverty of spirit, and an absolute renunciation of everything in this world. Well, aren't you also renouncing what the Bible says that you should do? And some of that's towards, what's being agreeable, right? Embrace these practices with all the energy of your soul, and you will find in a short time great delights and unspeakable consolations. Despise yourself and wish that others should despise you. Speak to your own disadvantage and desire others to do the same. Conceive a low opinion of yourself and find it good when others hold the same. To enjoy the taste of all things, have no taste for anything. To know of all things, learn to know nothing. To possess all things, resolve to possess nothing. To be all things, be willing to be nothing. To get where you have no taste for anything, go through whatever experiences you have no taste for. Well, Crowley talked about some of that, but in a different way, right? To learn to know nothing, go whither you are ignorant, to reach what you possess not, go whithersoever you own nothing, to be what you are not, experience what you are not. These latter verses play with that vertigo of self-contradiction which is so dear to mysticism. Those that come next are completely mystical, for in them St. John passes from God to the more metaphysical notion of the all. When you stop at one thing, you cease to open yourself to the all, for to come to the all you must give up the all, and if you should attain to owning the all, you must own it, desiring nothing. In this spoliation, the soul finds its tranquility and rest. Profoundly established in the center of its own nothingness, it can be assailed by naught that comes from below, and since it no longer desires anything, what comes from above cannot well depress it, for its desires alone are the causes of its woes. St. John de la Croix, Vie et Oevers, Paris, 1893, Volume 2, 94, 99 are the pages. And now, as a more concrete example of heads 4 and 5, in fact, of all our heads together, and of the irrational extreme to which a psychopathic individual may go in the line of bodily austerity, I will quote the sincere Suso's account of his own self-tortures. Suso, you will remember, is one of the 14th century German mystics. His autobiography, written in the third person, is a classic religious document. He was in his youth of a temperament full of fire and life, and when this began to make itself felt, it was very grievous to him, and he sought by many devices how he might bring his body into subjection. He wore for a long time a hair shirt and an iron chain until the blood ran from him, so that he was obliged to leave them off. He secretly caused an undergarment to be made for him, and in the undergarment he had strips of leather fixed, into which 150 brass nails, pointed and filed sharp, were driven, and the points of the nails were always turned towards the flesh. He had this garment made very tight, and so arranged as to go round him and fasten in the front, in order that it might fit the closer to his body, and the pointed nails might be driven into his flesh, and that it was high enough to reach upwards to his navel, and in this he used to sleep at night. Now, in summer, when it was hot, and he was very tired and ill from journeyings, or when he held the office of lecturer, he was sometimes, as he lay thus in bonds, and oppressed with toil, and tormented also by noxious insects, cry aloud, and give way to fretfulness, and twist round and round in agony, as a worm does when ran through with a pointed needle. It often seemed to him as if he were lying upon an anthill, from the torture caused by the insects, for if he wished to sleep, or when he had fallen asleep, they vied with one another. Insects, as in lice, were an unfailing token of medieval sainthood. We read of Francis of Assisi's sheepskin, that often a companion of the saint, would take it to the fire to clean and dispedicate it, doing so, as he said, because the seraphic father himself was no enemy of pedacci, but, on the contrary, kept them on him, la portava addosso, and held it for an honor and a glory to wear these celestial pearls in his habit, quoted by P. Sabatier, Speculum Perfectionis, etc., Paris, 1898, page 231. Sometimes he cried to Almighty God in the fullness of his heart, Alas, gentle God, what a dying is this! When a man is killed by murderers or strong beasts of prey, it is soon over, but I lie dying here under the cruel insects and cannot die. The nights in winter were never so long, nor was the summer so hot, as to make him leave off this exercise. On the contrary, he devised something farther, 2 leather loops into which he put his hands, and fastened one on each side his throat, and made the fastenings so secure that even if his cell had been on fire about him, he could not have helped himself, This continued until his hands and arms became almost tremulous with the strain, and then he devised something else. 2 leather gloves, and he caused a brazier to fit them all over with sharp, pointed brass tacks, and he used to put them on at night, in order that he should try, while asleep, to throw off the hair garment, or relieve himself from the gnawings of the vile insects. The tacks might then stick into his body, and so it came to pass, if ever he sought to help himself with his hands in his sleep, he drove the sharp tacks into his breast, and tore himself, so that his flesh festered. When, after many weeks, the wounds had healed, he tore himself again, and made fresh wounds. He continued this tormenting exercise for about 16 years. At the end of this time, when his blood was now chilled, and the fire of his temperament destroyed, there appeared to him, in a vision, on Whitsunday, a messenger from heaven, who told him that God required this of him no longer, whereupon he discontinued it, and threw all these things away into a running stream. Cecco then tells how to emulate the sorrows of his crucified Lord. He made himself a cross with 30 protruding iron needles and nails. This he bore on his back, between his shoulders, day and night. The first time that he stretched out this cross upon his back, his tender frame was struck with terror at it, and blunted the sharp nails slightly against a stone. But soon, repenting of this womanly cowardice, he pointed them all again with a file, and placed once more the cross upon him. It made his back, where the bones are, bloody and scarred. Whenever he sat down or stood up, it was as if a hedgehog's skin were on him, and if anyone touched him unawares or pushed against his clothes, it tore him. Suso next tells of his penitences by means of striking this cross and forcing the nails deeper into the flesh, and likewise of his self-scourgings, a dreadful story, and then goes on as follows. At this same period, the servitor procured an old castaway door, and he used to lie upon it at night without any bedclothes to make him comfortable, except that he took off his shoes and wrapped a thick cloak round him. He thus procured for himself a most miserable bed, for hard pea stalks lay in humps under his head, the cross with the sharp nails struck into his back. The arms were locked fast in bonds, the horsehair garment was round his loins, and the cloak, too, was heavy, and the door hard. Thus he lay in wretchedness, afraid to stir, just like a log, and he would send up many a sigh to God. And